Welcome to the debate. Today we're looking at the absolute breaking points of relationships.
The really fun, lighthearted stuff, right?
Oh yeah, completely stress-free topics today. We are basically dissecting that really fraught tension between setting necessary boundaries and, on the other hand, engaging in coercive manipulation, specifically when it comes to the use of ultimatums.
Right. And from there, we're going to examine the exact opposite side of that coin, which is how partners handle inevitable demands for change and criticism without, resorting to destructive defensiveness.
Yeah. So, to frame our disagreement clearly, my position today is that ultimatums are fundamentally a toxic form of emotional extortion that erodes trust, and that overcoming defensiveness requires a really conscious, active override of our ego.
And my position, to summarize it briefly, is that ultimatums are justified and sometimes the absolute only option in dangerous situations. And I'll argue that defensive reactions, particularly the silent treatment, are actually highly calculated active strategies designed to evade accountability.
Okay, so to begin, I want to frame my perspective around the fundamental architecture of a partnership. When two people commit to a relationship, they are entering into a collaborative contract.
Right, ideally.
Ideally. Exactly. The understanding is that you will face obstacles as a unified front. Now, the clinical definition of an ultimatum is essentially an attempt to manipulate a person into doing exactly what you want, right, by leveraging the relationship itself as the penalty.
Mm-hmm.
When you issue an ultimatum, you are violating that collaborative contract. You basically force your partner into a corner where their only options are compliance or the loss of the relationship. That is coercion, plain and simple.
I hear you, but
It creates an immediate power imbalance, and that breeds deep-seated resentment, and ultimately it destroys the psychological safety required for trust to flourish. And actually, you see a mirror image of this destruction in how people handle criticism.
how so?
Well, when someone responds to a partner's critique by yelling or immediately turning the blame back on them, they're sending a singular, fatal message. They're saying, I am not open to communication, and I refuse to accept fault. Both of these behaviors, ultimatums and defensive anger, are mechanisms that fundamentally shut down the bond.
I mean, I understand the desire to view relationships through that purely collaborative lens, but we really have to ground this in reality.
Okay, go on.
The problem with your framing of ultimatums is that it assumes all relationship conflicts exist in this vacuum of mundane, manageable disagreements. And we know from behavioral psychology that there is a massive gulf between a manipulative threat and a necessary boundary.
Sure, but a threat's a threat.
Is it, though? Yes, using an ultimatum to dictate, who your partner can be friends with is toxic. I agree with that. But what happens when the behavior is actually dangerous?
Well, that's...
If a partner is engaging in reckless substance abuse, or there's physical volatility, or, say, severe financial infidelity that threatens to literally bankrupt the household, an ultimatum is not a manipulation tactic in those scenarios. It is a vital, life-saving boundary. It's self-preservation.
I see the distinction you're making, but...
And just to touch on your point about criticism quickly, I absolutely agree that we hate acknowledging our flaws. We don't like everything about our partners 100% of the time, so criticism is totally inevitable. But we really need to look closer at how people defend themselves.
You mean beyond just yelling?
Yes, you mentioned yelling, but I want to look at the silent treatment. Because the silent treatment isn't just a failure to communicate. It is a highly effective strategic evasion. It's a way to maintain power by escaping responsibility entirely.
I want to dig right into this distinction you're making with ultimatums first, though, because this is where the structural integrity of the relationship is tested the most severely.
Sure.
I hear your point about self-preservation, but I'm really not convinced by that framing, because the structural mechanics of coercion, they remain identical whether the stakes are mundane or severe. Let's look at the psychological toll here.
Okay, let's look at it.
If I say to you, if you go out with that friend I don't like, I'll break up with you, I am forcing a choice between two things you care about. I am stripping you of your autonomy. Now elevate that to a severe situation. The mechanism of action is exactly the same.
I disagree entirely.
But you are overriding their agency with a threat of abandonment.
Life. In the dangerous scenario, the function is protection over your life.
Okay, but if a relationship relies on a threat to function,
If you have to hold a metaphorical gun to the head of the partnership to get your partner to behave, hasn't the trust already been fundamentally destroyed?
Well,
I mean, I would argue that in those severe cases you're describing, you aren't actually fixing the relationship with an ultimatum, you're just creating a hostage situation.
a hostage situation. That's a bit extreme.
Think about it. If the only reason my partner stops a destructive habit is because I threaten to leave, they aren't choosing health and they aren't choosing me. They are just yielding to terror. The partnership is basically already dead.
You're glossing over the darker implication of what happens if you don't draw that line, though. You say the trust is already dead in a scenario involving, say, severe addiction.
It is!
You're absolutely right. The trust is severely damaged, but the ultimatum isn't the tool destroying the trust. The dangerous behavior is. The ultimatum is just the final flare sent up before abandoning ship.
A flare.
Yes, it is stating a fact. I cannot exist in a hazardous environment. If the hazard continues, I have to remove myself. Framing that as, holding the relationship hostage completely invalidates the reality of victims who literally have no other leverage to force an intervention.
All right, I can certainly concede that extreme danger requires extreme boundaries. When physical or severe psychological safety is on the line, yeah, the normal rules of collaborative negotiation break down.
Exactly.
But if we pull back to where the vast majority of ultimatums actually occur, which is in those non-harmful, mundane situations, we have to ask why people default to such an aggressive tool. And I think it comes down to a profound inability to tolerate vulnerability.
How do you mean?
Well, the underlying desire to control a partner via an ultimatum stems from the exact same emotional deficit that we see when couples face criticism.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
Instead of saying, I feel incredibly insecure and terrified of being replaced when you spend time with that friend, they issue a threat. They say, stop seeing them or I'm gone.
Right. It's easier to be angry than sad.
Precisely. They demand change through brute force because asking for it through vulnerability feels like, exposing their throat. They are terrified of admitting they have needs that might not be met, so they try to rig the game so they can't lose.
That's actually a very compelling psychological through line. The inability to tolerate vulnerability drives the ultimatum when we want our partner to change, and it drives defensiveness when our partner wants us to change. It's basically two sides of the same coin of emotional self-protection.
Exactly, which naturally pivots us to how we receive demands for change. When your partner comes to you with a criticism, even a perfectly valid one, like you've been emotionally absent lately, or you aren't pulling your weight around the house, the natural instinct is to defend the ego.
Always.
Let me offer an analogy for how this works neurologically. Defensiveness is essentially a psychological circuit breaker.
A circuit breaker. Walk me through that.
So when you feel attacked by your partner's criticism, your ego senses an emotional overload. It is receiving more critique than it can safely process without shattering your self-image. So your brain trips the breaker.
The lights just go out?
Right, the lights go out. The argument stops, and you are safe from the surge. You yell, or, you flip the script and bring up something they did wrong 3 years ago.
Which we've all done.
Oh, absolutely. It protects your fragile ego in that immediate moment because you don't have to feel the sting of being inadequate. But the problem is, you're now sitting in the dark.
Yeah.
By tripping that breaker, you have completely cut off the power supply to the relationship. You survive the moment, but you sever the connection. You send a very clear message that you are closed for business.
I think the circuit breaker analogy is incredibly accurate for explosive, reactive defensiveness, like yelling or scorekeeping. But I want to zero in on a very specific type of defensiveness that I think requires a totally different framework.
The silent treatment?
The silent treatment. Because I argue that the silent treatment isn't just a tripped breaker. It is someone deliberately going down to the basement and cutting the main power lines to the house, so their partner has to stumble around in the dark.
Wow, that is a really dark way to look at it. You don't view the silent treatment as just a form of emotional overwhelm? Because, clinically, we know it is healthy to take space.
Sure. And taking space is a profoundly healthy, necessary tool. I am not arguing against that. But if you're listening to this and thinking, well, my partner just shuts down because they are overwhelmed, You really have to look at the mechanics of the outcome, not just the assumed intent.
Meaning what, exactly?
Taking space has a defined parameter. It's a pause button with a promise to return. The silent treatment, on the other hand, is the destruction of the communication apparatus entirely. It is not a failure of openness. It is a weaponization of it.
Weaponization in what sense?
It is control through absence. When you yell at your partner, as destructive as that is, you are at least giving them surface area to fight back. You're engaging.
Right, there's friction.
Exactly. But when you use the silent treatment, you leave them swinging at ghosts. You are essentially weaponizing your partner's attachment anxiety.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you trigger their primal fear of abandonment to force them to drop the criticism and instead focus entirely on begging you to just speak to them again. You shift the dynamics so thoroughly that the original critique is forgotten, and now they are the ones apologizing just to get you to acknowledge their existence.
I see the mechanics of what you were describing there. It's basically a unilateral dismissal. If you know you're in the wrong, giving the silent treatment absolves you of having to admit it.
Exactly. It's a calculated evasion of accountability. Just look at what happens to the partner on the receiving end. They are left in a complete void. They feel ignored, hurt, unloved.
Helpless, really.
Helpless, but most crucially, they are left with absolutely no mechanism to explain themselves, offer an apology, or find a compromise. You have entirely stripped them of their agency in the relationship. They are trapped.
I'm not entirely convinced that every instance of the silent treatment is quite that Machiavellian, to be honest. I think many people genuinely just lack the emotional vocabulary to articulate their feelings, so they freeze.
Maybe some do, yeah.
But I will concede that regardless of whether it's a malicious strategy or just a panicked freeze response, the clinical outcome really is the same. The partner is erased from the negotiation.
Right.
And that brings us to the core dilemma. If the circuit breaker of angry defensiveness and the suffocating void of the silent treatment are both completely fatal to the relationship, how do we actually override them?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because it's one thing to say communicate better, but it's another entirely to do it when your heart rate is at 120 beats per minute because your partner just criticized your parenting, you know?
Right. When your amygdala is hijacked, logic just goes right out the window. Your brain is reacting as if you're being chased by a predator, but the predator is just your spouse asking why you didn't pay the electric bill.
Exactly. So how do we keep the breaker from tripping? It requires a monumental level of cognitive override. You have to execute an active internal pivot in a fraction of a second. The first step is that you literally have to force a pause. You have to intellectually engage with what they are saying rather than emotionally reacting to how it makes you feel.
Which sounds beautiful in theory. Really, it does. But I have to push back on the reality of that. You are asking someone in the midst of an adrenaline dump to become a Zen monk.
Pretty much, yeah.
How do you practically pause when every single biological imperative is screaming at you to defend yourself?
You do it by shifting your curiosity. Instead of asking, how dare they say this to me, you have to train yourself to ask, why is this so important to them? You don't have to agree with the criticism right away, but you have to validate their reality.
Validate, even if they're wrong?
Yes, you have to take it as something that matters deeply to them, even if you think the facts are wrong. If your partner says, you never listen to me, your immediate instinct is to list the 5 times you listened to them yesterday, right?
Of course, I have the receipts.
Right, we all have the receipts, but that's the circuit breaker tripping. The cognitive override is saying, okay, they feel unheard right now. Let me address the feeling of being unheard rather than litigating the timeline. You move from an adversarial posture where one of you wins and one of you loses to a collaborative one where you are both looking at the problem together.
It is incredibly difficult work. I mean, it requires an immense amount of emotional maturity to hear that you are failing the person you love and not immediately try to shield yourself from that pain.
It does.
But, as you pointed out, the alternative is the slow, agonizing death of the relationship. When feelings of resentment silently accumulate from coercive ultimatums, or when intimacy withers away in the cold vacuum of the silent treatment, the relationship doesn't blow up. It just hollows out until there is nothing left.
And this brings us to a really crucial synthesis of our perspectives today, I think. We have explored the deep psychological mechanisms that dictate how we handle conflict. I still maintain my stance that prioritizing vulnerability over manipulation is the absolute bedrock of a functioning partnership.
Sure.
When we rely on mundane ultimatums, we are bypassing the difficult work of expressing our insecurities and instead forcing our partners into compliance through fear. We shatter the collaborative foundation that makes a relationship viable in the first place.
And I maintained that while vulnerability is absolutely the goal, we cannot ignore the utility of firm, immovable boundaries. In situations of real harm, an ultimatum is not a failure of vulnerability. It's a necessary act of self-preservation.
Right. Furthermore, we have to look clearly at defensive behaviors. Understanding the deeply evasive, power-shifting nature of the silent treatment is just crucial. We have to recognize it for what it is, a deliberate or at least highly functional escape from accountability that strips the other person of their voice. I think the profound point of convergence we found today is centered around that exact concept of agency. Whether through the coercion of a threat or the punishing absence of the silent treatment, any behavior that strips a partner of their voice, their autonomy, or their self-esteem will inevitably kill the bond.
100%.
A relationship requires two active participants. When you remove the other person's ability to participate, you no longer have a partnership. You just have a dictatorship.
We absolutely agree on that. Where we continue to respectfully disagree, and where I think the friction will probably always lie, is in that gray area. Exactly where is the line drawn between stating a boundary that protects you and issuing a threat that controls them? It is a highly subjective line.
Very subjective.
And it requires constant, rigorous self-reflection to know which side of it you are actually standing on.
It really does. And that is why dissecting these behavioral mechanics offers such incredible value. We are all fallible. You know, every single person listening to this has likely tripped that defensive circuit breaker or issued an unfair demand out of fear.
Oh, definitely.
Nobody is perfect, and expecting perfection from a partner is just a recipe for perpetual disappointment. The true beauty of a relationship isn't finding someone who never triggers your defensiveness, it's finding someone willing to do the really uncomfortable work of growing and calibrating alongside you.
It is a constant negotiation. The work of maintaining a relationship is never truly finished. It requires a willingness to look at our ugliest defense mechanisms and dismantle them, piece by piece.
Exactly. It brings to mind how we think about architectural resilience. When engineers build a suspension bridge, they don't design it to be perfectly, unyieldingly rigid. Right, it has to move.
Right. A bridge built of solid concrete with absolutely no flexibility might look indestructible, but the first time a hurricane hits, the stress fractures the concrete and the whole thing collapses. The strength of the bridge is actually in its ability to sway. It has to breathe. It has to absorb the pressure of the wind and the traffic without snapping. A partnership is exactly the same. It cannot be rigid, demanding perfect compliance through threats and ultimatums. Nor can it seal itself off behind a defensive circuit breaker at the first sign of structural stress.
Beautifully said.
It has to absorb the pressure of criticism, trusting that the foundational connection is strong enough to hold. The question we leave you with today is this. When the inevitable winds of conflict blow in your own relationships, are you desperately building walls to hide behind, or are you learning how to sway?